Blame it on my juice. No, I'm not a snack at all. Look, baby, I'm the whole damn
All right, all right, all right. Welcome, 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 everybody. I'm so glad to see so many of you. Welcome to Sunrise Movement's April 25th Green New Deal teach-in. We are very happy to have so many beautiful people here. I'm just so happy to see all of y'all in community to learn about the very thing that is the mission of this movement, the Sunrise Movement, stopping climate change and creating millions of good jobs in the process. Let's introduce today's facilitators. I'll start. My name is Josiah. Hi, everyone. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I've been organizing with Sunrise for just over a year. Outside of Sunrise, I'm a full-time student attending a local community college. I joined this movement because I believe in fighting for a better world. I'll pass it off to Celia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Celia. I use she or they pronouns, and I've been organizing with Sunrise for about a year and a half. I am fighting for a world where we have a fundamentally different relationship to the land and to each other. And I'll pass it to Jacob.
Hey everybody, my name is Jacob. I use he, him pronouns, and I've been with Sunrise for about a year now. And I'm in this movement to fight for liberation for all people, and I'll pass it to Angela.
Hi everyone, I'm Angela. I use she, her pronouns. I've been with Sunrise for about 6 months, and I'm in this movement to fight for a meaningful and joyful home for everybody. Over to you, Ed.
Hey, my name's Ed. I use he, him pronouns. I've been with Sunrise for about a year and a half, and I'm fighting for hot summer days where we can lie in the shade under large birch trees instead of rebuilding houses demolished by the greed of the fossil fuel industry. And Josiah, it's all you.
That's right, everybody. So thank you again for everybody for being here. As you can see on this slide, we had a team of wonderful, amazing people working behind the scenes, and they're continuing to work right now to make sure that this teach-in is as successful as possible and ensure that you all get access to this amazing information that we have to learn in community and in depth with one another. So, just show a little appreciation in the chat for, everybody you see on that slide. They've done an amazing job this far, and I'm so excited to organize with them. All right. Go ahead, Celia.
All right, so we know that people are coming from a lot of different places, both physically. We see all of you all over the country and all over the world tuning in, but also in terms of what we're bringing to this space. So we're gonna read off some welcomes, and if any resonate with you, you can put a star or a plus sign in the chat. We want to welcome people of all ages, whether you're in middle school, high school, or college, whether you're a teenager, in your 20s, 30s, or an older ally. You are welcome here.
We want to welcome people of all genders we want to welcome people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. Whether you identify as Black, Indigenous, White, Asian, Latinx, or mixed race, you're all welcome here.
We want to welcome people of all genders and sexualities. Whether you're trans, non-binary, cis, queer, or straight, you are all welcome here.
We want to welcome people of all socioeconomic classes, whether you're working class, middle class, owning class, or anywhere else on this scale, you are most welcome.
We want to welcome people whose families are supportive of this work, as well as those of you whose families don't even know you're on this call. We welcome you.
We want to welcome those who may be feeling nervous about being here. Maybe you haven't considered if the work you've done in the past could be considered organizing or activism. You're welcome here.
Now we want to open it up to the group to give your own welcomes. So please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will read some of these off.
So people of all abilities, yes. Thank you. Everybody who wants a Green New Deal. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Welcome.
So I already saw a bunch of people in the chat when they joined this meeting drop whose indigenous land they're on, but we wanted to start off today by doing a land and water acknowledgement to honor the indigenous peoples whose land we're currently on, who are still here defending this land in spite of a system which continues to oppress them. So we're going to have everybody pull up the website native-land.ca and go ahead and drop in the chat whose land you're on, as a way to show solidarity with Indigenous people and ground ourselves in the knowledge that we're living on Indigenous land. I see some fellow Tongva people, Chumash. It's going fast in the chat. Wabanaki. Wow, that's great. I appreciate everyone doing that. On the next slide, Celia is going to walk us through some teaching norms.
Thanks, Jacob. So we ask that you please remove distractions, get a beverage, some water or tea. If you're a note taker, get some materials so you can take notes, and center yourself. We'd also like to encourage you to keep your cameras on if you're willing and able. It's nice to see everybody's faces. If you are having any tech problems, please private message Grayson, who has tech in all caps in their Zoom name, and they will try to help you. Feel free to use the chat throughout the session to react to what's being presented. If something being discussed on the slides or in the chat really resonates with you, you could drop one or more plus signs to show your support for that point. Please save any questions you have for the end of each section. We'll remind you when to ask questions in the chat, and we'll collect them and send out an FAQ sheet via email after the teach-in. Throughout the teach-in, we will have moments where we will invite you to share your thoughts on certain topics. We encourage you to participate via the chat during those activities. Lastly, we ask for you all to be here with each other and to be present with the community to learn and grow together. We will not tolerate any bullying or hateful language in the chat, and we have moderators who will be kicking people out if that happens, so this remains a safe space for community learning. Angela, the floor is yours.
To help structure our slides for you, we have a couple of different symbols that serve as markers for different content. This ribbon symbol acknowledges the start of a new section. The asterisk denotes a moment for active participation, and we will be having a break about halfway through today's session. Most sections will also end with a set of key takeaways to help recap what we just covered.
All right, so you might be wondering as you've come into this space, why call this a teach-in? Well, a teach-in is a space for community learning for the purpose of taking collective action. And that is what we're here to do. In this teach-in, we are going to ground ourselves in the Green New Deal's vision for a livable future. Indeed, for many of us, learning about the Green New Deal sparked our imagination and gave us hope and brought us into the movement. We will send out the slides, video links, additional resources, and upcoming action opportunities so everybody has the opportunity to have access to what will be going on. Now, before we get underway, we want to start off by noting that today's teach-in is part of the Sunrise Movement's current campaign called Good Jobs for All. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Sunrise Movement, we are a movement led by young people to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. Our movement is currently embarking on the Good Jobs for All campaign in order to accomplish the first part of a Green New Deal, a federal jobs guarantee. If there were ever a time for this campaign, it is now. After seeing the inequities of our society laid bare because of the COVID-19 pandemic, where many of us were left unemployed by no fault of our own and unsupported by our own government, or with jobs that didn't or still don't pay the bills, we really wanted to emphasize this important part of the Green New Deal, which brings us to our campaign goals. There are two big goals that Sunrise has for this year and for this campaign in particular. The first one is in response to the once-in-a-generation opportunity that's before us right now. As I mentioned before, we want to win the first step of the Green New Deal. Our movement has been in the streets and organizing for 4 years to get us to a place where we can even talk about passing federal climate and jobs legislation. And now it's time for us to put something into law. the big opportunity for us to do this is by ensuring that President Biden and the Democrats in Congress pass an ambitious climate-focused infrastructure package that is rooted in justice. But we've also always known that the Green New Deal was going to be more than just one singular bill and was going to take many years to achieve. So the second goal is that we continue to grow our people power for future wins by talking to our communities about the Green New Deal, good jobs for all, and reimagining what is politically possible in this country. In other words, we need to set our movement up to continue getting wins that tangibly improve people's lives throughout the rest of the Biden administration and beyond. All right, let's cut to the chase for a moment, shall we? Here's what Sunrise is calling for to be included in the final infrastructure package that's going to be passed later this year. And don't worry, we'll be explaining all of these things in more detail in just a little bit. First, we want to see the federal government guarantee millions of good jobs fighting climate change and transforming our society. And one of the best ways to do this is by fully funding a new program called the Civilian Climate Corps. Second, we want to see $10 trillion invested over the next 10 years to totally transform our society. Right now, Biden has proposed $2.7 trillion for his infrastructure proposal. Not nearly enough. And finally, we want to see this all done while upholding Indigenous sovereignty, equity, and environmental justice standards with strong workforce and union rights, including through the Protect the Right to Organize Act, also known, more commonly known as the PRO Act. But how can we get our elected officials on board with us is the true question. As an organizing tool for our campaign, Sunrise created the Good Jobs for All pledge to build support for our demands amongst members of Congress, and then hold them accountable when legislation is debated. Okay, that's a little bit of context about this teach-in and how it fits into the larger campaign and work of the Sunrise Movement. If you have any questions about this section, please ask them in the chat right now. But now let's get started with reviewing the agenda for what we'll be covering today. And for that, I'm going to hand it over to my fellow facilitator, Jacob, who will also be talking us through our first section of the teach-in.
Thank you, Josiah, for that wonderful intro. I also want to thank everyone just for being here today. I'm so excited for this teach-in and to have the privilege of being in community with everyone on this call. Today, we're going to talk about how we got here, what the Green New Deal is, what kind of power we need to build in our communities to win, Biden's American Jobs Plan and the political moment we're in, common criticisms of the Green New Deal and how to respond to them, climate solutions, and a just transition. We're also going to provide actions that you and your hub can take today to support the Green New Deal and good jobs for all. And towards the end of today, we'll do a mini training on how to talk about the Green New Deal with your community. We'll be going through a lot in a short amount of time, but we will have activities and some breaks so that we don't get Zoom fatigue. So we're going to get started today by talking about how we got to this moment. We know that decades of the government and politicians prioritizing the consolidation of wealth and power with the rich have left working class, BIPOC, and frontline communities without the resources needed to weather the multiple crises we're dealing with today. Decades of government inaction and environmental injustice have left the most vulnerable communities bearing the brunt of climate change. We have a broken healthcare system that puts profit over people's lives. We have an elite-driven and ever-increasing wealth gap that reinforces class division and the hogging of the Earth's resources by the few. Systemic racial injustice continues to harm BIPOC communities. We have seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and want to acknowledge the liberatory work that Black organizers have done and continue to do today. We recognize that this rings truer now more than ever as the nation experiences a long overdue racial reckoning and calls for justice for the lives of Adam Toledo, Dante Wright, Micaiah Bryant, and so many others. And lastly, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed holes in our social support structures and left avoidable deaths in its wake. Now that we've set the scene, we want to ask you all to answer these two questions in the chat. How are you seeing the impacts of these crises in your life and your community? And how do the multiple crises of our time relate to each other? So go ahead, take a second to answer those questions in the chat. Celia said worse and worse wildfire seasons. Yes, thank you. Increased asthma rates and poverty. The struggles we see have made the issues personal. That's a great point. Fear and anxiety, sea level rise in my town, extreme amounts of grief. I will say I completely resonate with all the reasons that people are bringing up, and I appreciate people sharing that in the chat. Now we're going to watch a short clip from a video from Ray, a sunriser who tells his story about growing up in Detroit. He'll talk about how these same crises intersect in his hometown and how our economy is set up to make our environment and us as people disposable for the sake of profit.
My name is Ray Norton, and I'm 18 years old. This is how climate change and pollution has affected me. One of my most distinct memories growing up in Detroit is going south on I-75. Smelling the pollution coming from Marathon and seeing the smoke and the fire on the freeway. I remember trying to hold my breath as long as I could, but eventually you have to breathe in. I've lived in Detroit my whole life. We bounced around a lot when I was a kid. We couldn't always afford to pay rent, and neither could a lot of my friends and family. I know that the planet is on a path towards destruction, and I know that it's caused by the same people who produce the smells and the smoke on the freeway. Poor people, minorities, and young people like me are facing violence and threats in our lives every day from a system that treats us like resources to be extracted.
Wow, that was a powerful video, and it was powerful to see people share their personal stories in the chat. What Ray and some of you brought up are the results of the problem that is the root cause of all the crises that we see today. And that problem is the belief that it's acceptable for some people to control and harm other people and the earth for their own profit. There's some people that believe the government has no role to play in improving people's lives or addressing these crises. But we know that things have to change and that the solution must grow from a different idea, that everybody is inherently worthy of dignity and respect and that nobody is expendable. The government belongs to us and it has a responsibility to fix the crises it has caused and improve people's lives. The solutions born out of this new way of thinking are many, and Angela is going to walk us through those in the next section of slides. But first, if you have any questions about this section, please ask them in the chat now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jacob. So we are here today to introduce the Green New Deal as a solution that does grow from this different belief, this belief that everyone is inherently valued. But before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you all about what comes to your mind when you think of the Green New Deal. What does the Green New Deal evoke for you? What do you envision when you think about the Green New Deal? So drop some ideas and impressions in the chat and I will read some of these out. I see hope, jobs and infrastructure, environmental justice. Yeah. Jobs, equity, living future. These are all such great hopes and dreams for a world under the Green New Deal. And thank you so much for sharing all of those things. So there are so many things that we can be imagining about a world with the Green New Deal. And so right now we'd like to show you one vision of that world narrated by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing for the fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, The biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, Indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Oh my gosh, this vision always inspires me so much. And I'm seeing already a lot of reactions and love in the chat. So I'd like to just open that space and ask in 1 or 2 words, how does this video make you feel? Inspired, empowered, hopeful. Yeah. So a big emotion for me is definitely excitement about the Green New Deal becoming a reality for all of us. So let's dive in and explore what the Green New Deal really is. And the first thing to know about it is that it's not a bill. It's not a policy proposal or something that could become legislation. Instead, it's a non-binding resolution with a simple goal of defining the problem we're facing and defining the scope of potential solutions. It is a vision document that gives members of Congress the opportunity to express their support or disapproval on topics that they cannot otherwise vote on, which then gives the public a preview of how our elected officials might vote on future legislation. So to make the vision of the Green New Deal a reality, we will need Congress and the president to pass dozens of new laws and policies over the next 10 years. So in short, the Green New Deal is a congressional resolution that offers a roadmap for how America can create a carbon-free economy, solve inequalities, and create millions of good jobs all in the next 10 years. No big deal. The Green New Deal is one of the only plans that has been put forward that is in alignment with scientific consensus. It also focuses on creating the maximum amount of prosperity for working people and marginalized communities in the process. It exists at the intersection of the movements for climate action, racial justice, labor rights, and other areas of social progress. And it's about achieving environmental justice, economic equity, and universal healthcare. So what does that mean? It means that there's no climate justice without social justice. So if you care about clean air and water, then you should also care about protecting Indigenous communities. If you care about sustainable businesses, then you should also care about fixing racial and gender wealth imbalances. And if you care about renewable energy, then you should also care about ensuring rights for workers in the renewables industry. Everything is interconnected, and we'll be touching on that fact throughout the teaching. So just this past Tuesday, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey reintroduced the Green New Deal resolution to Congress with 103 House co-sponsors. What's also exciting is that other forward-thinking members of Congress have put forth over a dozen other Green New Deal-related bills and resolutions on topics ranging from public housing to new funding for cities to building energy-resilient communities. In the words of Representative Ocasio-Cortez, we're going to transition to a 100% carbon-free economy that is more unionized, more just, more dignified, and guarantees more healthcare and housing than we ever have before. That's our goal. The Green New Deal resolution is just 14 pages, but it contains two big ideas. The first part states what America has to do to solve the impending climate crisis. Basically, we need to completely stop burning fossil fuels. And the second part talks about how we'll protect and uplift people during the transition away from fossil fuels and beyond. Our current system is built on inequality and does not provide everyone with the basic means to achieve a good life. Therefore, protecting people is not only about guaranteeing economic security for fossil fuel workers who are already losing their jobs to the clean energy sector, but it is also about ensuring that all Americans can lead safe and dignified lives. The Green New Deal resolution has 5 overarching goals that covers those two parts. So first, decarbonize every sector to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. Create millions of good union jobs through a federal jobs guarantee, make massive investments in green infrastructure, secure clean air, water, food, and access to nature for all people, and protect and invest in frontline and vulnerable communities. So keep these 5 goals in mind because we're going to revisit them a bit later when we talk about Biden and the upcoming infrastructure package. In order to achieve these 5 goals, we will need to deploy many strategies across all sectors of society. Just some examples of these strategies include investing in renewable energy sources, expanding electric vehicles and affordable public transit, building resilience to climate disasters, spurring clean manufacturing, repairing and retrofitting infrastructure, and fostering regenerative farming practices. We'll also need to deploy strategies that will help protect people as we transition away from fossil fuels and towards a sustainable economy. And these strategies include a federal good jobs guarantee, providing affordable education and job training, ensuring environmental justice and indigenous sovereignty, protecting public lands, waters, and oceans, implementing Medicare for all and more public housing, and public banking and adequate civic ownership of projects. All of this will take a lot of work, good, real, meaningful work around which we must mobilize the entire country. So in this section, we learned that the Green New Deal is a visionary congressional resolution, not a bill, that it exists at the intersection of many movements for change, and that it states that the US must do 2 main things. First, decarbonize every sector of its economy. Second, protect workers and frontline communities in the process. But is the Green New Deal achievable? Let's find out in the next section with Celia. But first, if you have questions about this section, please ask them in the chat right now.
Thank you, Angela, for that amazing Green New Deal introduction. So we understand the crises that the Green New Deal will address and why a solution this big is needed to avert climate catastrophe and address decades of racial and economic inequality. Luckily, America has overcome similar challenges in the past. So now let's take a look at the New Deal, the historical precedent for the Green New Deal, how our current political structure is failing to meet the crisis, and learn how we can build people and political power to win a Green New Deal. We are not reinventing the wheel here. America has mobilized at mass scale before. The Green New Deal is modeled after President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, a series of executive orders and laws passed in the 1930s to revive America during a time of social upheaval in the wake of the Great Depression. Programs that we take for granted today, such as Social Security, unemployment benefits, the 40-hour work week, and many environmental and financial protections, were created during this short period of time. Through the New Deal programs, the government put millions of people to work, transforming our infrastructure, conserving land and forests, and even creating inspiring public art like the mural seen on the left. In fact, so many jobs were created that the federal government became the largest employer in the nation. When we faced the threat of fascism during World War II, the federal government mobilized the American economy and workforce. The New Deal was ambitious enough to even publicly advertise recruitment for its programs directly to the American people. It was an all hands on deck approach to mobilization. However, the New Deal left many people behind. The jobs mostly went to white men and further increased racial, gender, and economic disparities. We need the same kind of mobilization across the country and throughout all sectors of society for the Green New Deal. To pull this off, we need to enlist millions of people into the meaningful work of securing our future. But this time, we have the opportunity to mobilize in order to benefit everyone, not just middle-class white men. So how do we make that kind of society-wide mobilization happen? Well, President Biden can meet this moment and play a huge role in advancing Green New Deal policies. He can take inspiration from the New Deal, and he can learn from FDR's mistakes. Let's watch this video to see what that would look like.
We have to go back to March 4th, 1933.
Overcast and sullen, shadowed by uncertainty in Washington and throughout the land.
FDR entered his first term at the height of the Great Depression, while environmental disaster was ravaging the Southern Plains and fascism was on the rise. A new era of politics was about to be born.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Like Biden, FDR was elected and pushed into action by popular movements demanding change in a time of crisis. He met the moment by mobilizing every government power at his disposal to help working Americans. He established the Civilian Conservation Corps, which employed hundreds of thousands of young men to plant billions of trees and build the state and national parks that we enjoy today. The Works Progress Administration put millions of unemployed Americans to work, building the nation's infrastructure. As New Deal programs took effect, a newly empowered labor movement organized with progressive politicians to place laws on FDR's desk, like the National Labor Relations Act, which provided a path for millions of workers to join unions and collectively bargain with their employers. And while much of the New Deal was done in coordination with Congress, FDR exercised a level of executive power never before seen in the US, and never seen since. His work included a record-shattering 3,728 executive orders. When the U.S. joined World War II, FDR created the Office of War Mobilization to coordinate an unprecedented surge in wartime production.
It would assure we have the right numbers of workers in the right places at the right time.
So as we saw in that video, FDR signed 3,728 executive orders to meet the needs of the day, far more than any president since. Biden has the power to issue executive orders at a similar rate as one effective strategy to move quickly on Green New Deal policies. So what will Biden do? Through executive orders and legislation, FDR created bold, sweeping programs and policies to pull the country out of the Great Depression, and President Biden can do the same to meet this moment. The climate movement has pushed Biden during his campaign to get a lot more serious about the climate crisis. In his first days in office, we got a number of wins because of the people power we have, because we have organized, marched, and made our voices heard. These include no new oil or gas leases on federal lands, establishing the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy, and creating the Civilian Climate Corps to put people to work restoring our ecosystems, which Jacob is going to be talking about more in the next section. Biden also halted construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, committed that 40% of green investments will go to frontline communities, and appointed Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior, making her the first Indigenous person to serve in a cabinet position. A priority for Haaland and President Biden is to ensure free, prior, and informed consent of new development on tribal lands. These are great wins, which we should be really proud of. And while these executive orders will start to shift our economy away from fossil fuels and towards a just carbon-free economy, we know they aren't enough. We also need Congress working with Biden to enact the boldest legislation possible. Because the Green New Deal requires coordinated national action to transform every aspect of our society over an extended period of time, and only the federal government can achieve that. But this massive government action isn't part of our political common sense. Our political common sense is our collective understanding of what is possible and what the government's role is. And that changed with FDR and the New Deal. FDR brought populist ideas like the right to a job and healthcare and an education to the forefront of American politics and government action. During the New Deal, the American people understood that the government must play an essential role in regulating corporations, creating ladders of upward mobility, and ensuring that economic winners, the wealthy, pay their fair share. Our political common sense changed again with Ronald Reagan in the 80s, who railed against big government spending, welfare queens, and claimed to represent the silent majority of Americans. Reagan made the populist ideas of FDR toxic in Washington, pushing Democrats further to the right in an attempt to appeal to white voters. As he famously even said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Sadly, these effects are still felt today. For example, broadly popular common sense policies like a $15 minimum wage sound preposterous to many Democrats in Congress who are fearful of rocking the boat. But it wasn't just Reagan's own beliefs that changed our political common sense. It was also massive amounts of money from corporations being poured into our political system and the media. CEOs of fossil fuel companies and other big corporations have been bankrolling our politicians, buying influence to move them away from supporting a government that protects and values every American. They have used divide and conquer strategies across race and class lines to weaken the will of the people, not to mention to instill doubt and denial around climate change. This has been a decades-long strategy to protect their profits and block progress every step of the way. They do this because our current economy needs our environment and people to be disposable. Their divide and conquer strategy has 3 phases. 1, deceive the government. 2, buy out politicians. And 3, consolidate power in government. Our current political common sense allows these corporations and billionaire CEOs to corrupt our government. And it's caused many of us to feel discouraged, powerless, and unable to make change. When we hear politicians or even our friends, family, and coworkers say things like, "That's pie in the sky thinking," or "That'll never get done," it's a manifestation of this political common sense. As organizers, we have to acknowledge that our vision for a better future is in tension with the current political common sense, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. Our work is twofold: to advocate for the boldest policies and elect the most courageous representatives, and to shift the public narrative about who we are and what we stand for as a country. On the political left, there is a new common sense emerging, and it's supported by something we call the People's Alignment. We can think of the People's Alignment as a broad coalition of movements that believes in solidarity, dignity, and justice for all people, and uses strong government action to protect the common good. These movements are not new. Most have existed for a long time, but the broader coalition is newer and growing in strength. The People's Alignment can change our understanding of what is possible for our government to accomplish. Put a plus in the chat if you or someone you know is a part of one of these groups or movements. And you can even write which groups or movements you're part of. There are probably multiple different groups you, your family, and your friends are a part of. By mobilizing within and across our communities, we will build the collective power needed for our political common sense to change. So we need to build the strength of the People's Alignment. But when we talk to people about the Green New Deal, we also have to understand another challenge called tactical framing, which is a product of our current political common sense. If you've ever seen the Green New Deal discussed on the news, you've probably noticed that most of the conversation revolves around whether the Green New Deal will help or hurt Democrats, or that it costs too much, rather than the actual substance of the policy. For more on this, we're going to check out a clip from this video.
Sunday, the Democratic divide. Some progressives are pushing hard for a Green New Deal, but other Democrats worry they're being impractical.
Is there a risk that Democrats maybe overplay their hand, rile up the Republican base, and you say, look, socialism, and you know, some of these unrealistic ideas?
Tactical framing sounds like when you crop your problem areas out of a Tinder photo. Or a video. But it's actually an approach to news coverage that focuses on strategy over substance. So instead of asking, is this new policy proposal a good idea? Tactical framing asks, is it popular? Can it pass? How will it play in the next election?
The discussion is focused on the players and the implications for them and their political careers, not the policy or its capacity to solve a problem.
Kathleen Hall Jamieson coined the phrase tactical framing, and she argues that this obsession with strategy is making it hard for us to understand big policy ideas.
Ask yourself how much of the coverage of the Green New Deal has told you what specifically is in it.
Other Republicans said the plan sounded more like communist economic doctrine.
You probably have no idea what the Green New Deal is. You probably have some sense that it has to do with climate change, but you probably don't know much beyond that.
It is hard to argue with her. Look at some of the headlines from the Green New Deal debate. Is the Green New Deal smart politics for Democrats? Green New Deal divides Democrats on climate change. 7 reasons Democrats won't pass a Green New Deal. We're talking about the fate of the human race here, but the focus is still on the politics.
Could the fight over this plan divide the Democratic Party?
Well, Republicans succeeded painting it as an unrealistic boondoggle.
Notice when you're saying that, you're not asking, well, what is the problem they're trying to address? Is this a viable solution?
So after watching that clip, you might be feeling a little bit like, WTF? Tactical framing certainly helps to explain a lot. So if we can't rely on changing the way the press talks about policy to help us, then what can we do? Well, there's hope in numbers. We can challenge tactical framing and realign our political common sense in support of the Green New Deal by building up our people power, a critical mass of Americans standing up in moral protest to demand action from our government. And what exactly does a critical mass look like? It turns out it only takes 3.5% of a population to commit to nonviolent action and civil disobedience to change our government. Dr. Erica Chenoweth is a researcher who studied 234 campaigns from around the world from 1900 to 2006, and found that out of 100 nonviolent campaigns, the ones that succeeded mobilized at least 3.5% of the population, and many succeeded with much less. It's also worth noting that many of these movements aim to overthrow violent regimes, which is much more than we're trying to accomplish. These were grassroots campaigns that succeeded because people organized with their neighbors and friends, and we can do the same thing to win a Green New Deal. So where do we stand currently? What support does the Green New Deal have amongst the public? Well, the goals of the Green New Deal are already broadly popular across American society. The guarantee of good jobs with good wages for all workers is the single most popular goal. And 78% of Americans say they would support the Green New Deal if it would accomplish that, and only 20% say they would oppose it. Surveyed voters want their member of Congress to support the Green New Deal and co-sponsor it, and members should know that voters will support them in 2022 if they sponsor the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal has been polarized by politicians and the media, resulting in much of the public not hearing about it or understanding its substance. So, is the Green New Deal achievable? This is the question we asked before, and our answer is yes, but it will take all the people and political power that we can muster to achieve it. Remember, 3.5% or less. So, our key takeaways are: we've moved Biden on climate, and now we need to make sure he embraces his FDR moment. We need to shift the country's political common sense in order for our government to mobilize at the scale of the crisis. And research shows that if we attain the active participation of 3.5% or less of the population, we can win. If you have questions about this section, please ask them in the chat now. And now we're going to hear from Jacob about the moment we're in.
Thanks, Celia. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the political moment we're in. This section has a lot going on in it, so I'm going to ask that everyone stays with me, and I'll do my best to break it all down. With Biden in office, it's now our job to continue pushing his administration to address the many crises we face, including climate change. We've taken stock of our recent wins, and now we need to understand the shortcomings of Biden's American jobs plan so we know where we need to push and where we need to direct our people power. Last Thursday, Biden hosted leaders from around the world for a virtual summit, which included representatives from 40 countries who are responsible for the overwhelming majority of global carbon emissions. At the summit, Biden announced that the US will seek to cut emissions by at least 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. He also pressured other world leaders to sign on to similar pledges, though those are non-binding. The IPCC report says we need to globally decrease our emissions by half by 2030. But certain countries, including the US, have been industrialized the longest and have perpetuated extractive capitalism across the globe and have historically emitted far more than others. And therefore, they bear the majority of the responsibility for the climate crisis. This map shows regions on a scale from low to extreme climate vulnerability. The pink or the light purple color represents a region of low risk, which would be impacted the least by climate change. Blue represents medium risk, and the bright turquoise represents regions of high risk that would face the worst effects of climate change and may become uninhabitable. Countries like the US, Europe, Australia, Japan, and China are low risk, but have historically emitted far more than the regions who have the highest risk for being impacted by climate change. We have to acknowledge the colonialism, imperialism, and extractive practices that have led to this. Higher income nations that are already industrialized and have benefited the most from fossil fuel economies must stop emitting much sooner to balance out the rising emissions from the developing nations, while also exploring how to financially support the developing nations to create renewable energy grids. For the sake of people all over the world, we must continue to push our government to take more immediate and drastic actions. So I know stuff can get confusing with so many names and bills and different acronyms. So we're going to break down some recent developments in legislation that we need to be focused on. On March 31st, 2021, Biden announced the American Jobs Plan, also commonly referred to in the media as the infrastructure package. It's a huge priority for his administration and Democrats this year, and it currently aims to invest $2 to $3 trillion over 8 years. It's important to note that the American Jobs Plan is just Biden's proposal for an infrastructure package. It will be negotiated and deliberated on by members of Congress, and if passed, it would be signed into law, likely in August or September. So when you hear the words American Jobs Plan or infrastructure package, they're the same thing. So what's in Biden's infrastructure proposal? Biden's plan would invest $2.7 trillion over 8 years. This would be the largest federal investment in solving social and economic crises in 50 years. But it's nowhere near enough to meaningfully combat the climate crisis or transform our society and economy. To really do those things, we need at least $10 trillion in federal spending over the next decade, or $1 trillion per year. And we need to start making those investments as soon as possible. So how does Biden's infrastructure proposal stack up against the Green New Deal goals? The Green New Deal calls for decarbonizing all sectors of our economy so that the Earth's average temperature stays below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. But Biden's plan focuses on renewable energy and electric vehicles, leaving out many emission-heavy sectors of our economy like transportation and manufacturing. The Green New Deal creates millions of good jobs and guarantees a living wage. And while Biden's plan would create thousands of good union jobs along with investments in the care economy, Biden makes no mention of a guaranteed living wage. We are calling for massive investments in green infrastructure, and Biden has heeded that call by proposing investments to upgrade our electrical grid and transportation systems. We know that clean air, food, and water for all is needed to build community resilience, but Biden's plan only guarantees clean water. Lastly, we know that to address inequality, there must be investment in frontline communities, and Biden's infrastructure proposal directs 40% of investments to disadvantaged communities and creates a $16 billion program intended to help fossil fuel workers transition into new jobs. As we can see here, Biden's infrastructure proposal is a good step, but it's simply not enough. Let's see how the proposal scores on the rest of the Green New Deal. Biden's infrastructure proposal only upgrades 2 million out of around 140 million housing units across the country. This meets Biden's campaign promise of 1.7 million sustainable homes, but is far short of the vision of the Green New Deal. Biden downsized his research and development budget from the campaign promise of $300 billion to only $180 billion. And much of this money would go to fossil fuel companies and big agriculture. Biden's plan invests significantly less money into transportation compared to bills introduced by Senators Schumer, Warren, and Markey, which propose moving to 100% electrified and sustainable public transit and electric vehicles. Lastly, Biden's plan falls short on job creation. His version of the Civilian Climate Corps would create 200,000 jobs, but we know the government is capable of much more, and we need millions of good jobs to fight climate change. So overall, Biden's infrastructure proposal isn't doing too great. With Democrats in control of Congress and the White House, we have the opportunity to push for the transformative legislation that we need, but it may not come as a shock to many of you. It turns out Congress and our government is very dysfunctional. In an attempt to circumvent this dysfunction, the Democrats in Congress are using a process called budget reconciliation, where they can include many pieces of legislation into one big bill that is voted on as a single package instead of passing each bill individually. This is important for us. The Democrats can use the budget reconciliation process to pass the infrastructure package. Most of the pieces of legislation we are excited about, they won't pass on their own. So our number one priority isn't getting every member of Congress signed onto every single bill. Our priority is really bigger than that. Our movement's job over the next few months is to ensure the most ambitious, most just version of the infrastructure bill is put forward and signed into law. Luckily, there are a lot of great pieces of legislation that would help us move towards the vision of the Green New Deal, such as the PRO Act, which would usher in a wave of worker organizing and be a massive win for the labor movement. The Thrive Act, which calls for a green and just recovery, and the Green New Deal for public housing, which would invest billions to improve health, safety, and comfort in federal public housing. Then there's the Energy Resilient Communities Act, which puts low-income communities at the front of the line for clean energy grants and prioritizes energy equity, or the National Climate Emergency Act, which calls on the president to declare a national climate emergency. There's also HR 1, which would help create a more equitable democracy by expanding voting rights, and so many more. Not all of these can be part of the infrastructure package, but many components of them can. Our goal is to get as many Green New Deal aligned policies as we can into the final infrastructure package. And our top priority right now is the Civilian Climate Corps. The Civilian Climate Corps is a visionary bill that would create a government's jobs program, putting a new generation of Americans to work combating the climate crisis. Sounds familiar, right? The Civilian Climate Corps was inspired by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was one of FDR's signature New Deal programs during the Great Depression. The program pulled millions of men out of unemployment and improved our nation's infrastructure. But the Civilian Conservation Corps was also deeply oppressive. It had exclusionary, racist, and sexist practices of hiring almost solely white men and continued America's legacy of non-consensual development on stolen Native American land. That's why to succeed this time around, the modern Civilian Climate Corps must be deeply rooted in equity, indigenous sovereignty, be brave enough to face the scale of the climate crisis, and prioritize giving good jobs to communities who have been disproportionately harmed by systemic racism and our broken economy. In March 2021, Biden asked Congress to provide $10 billion, AKA not nearly enough money to fund the program as part of his American Jobs Plan. And that plan is now headed to Congress, and that severely underfunded version of the Civilian Climate Corps will be negotiated on and ultimately put into an infrastructure package that Congress will vote on. So how do we get the CCC to where it needs to be? Enter the guy we know and love, Senator Ed Markey. Last week, Senator Ed Markey rolled out a proposal for the Civilian Climate Corps that our generation and country needs. His bill calls for an investment of $80 billion, and would employ an equitable and diverse group of 1.5 million Americans in 5 years versus the laughable 200,000 jobs Biden's plan provides. The 1.5 million jobs in Markey's version of the CCC would help complete projects in clean energy, climate resilience, conservation, and sustainable infrastructure while providing education, training, and career pathways to good union jobs. It's a sort of ambition and scale our movement wants to see. If passed into law, Markey's version of the CCC would signify the beginning of the decade of the Green New Deal and open the door for better, bigger employment programs down the road. It's our movement's job to make sure the most ambitious version of a CCC that's rooted in justice makes it into the final infrastructure package and gets signed into law. The video we watched earlier of Ileana's first job remediating land is within our reach if we work together and build power. Some of the most effective things we can do to win a CCC are continuing to talk to our neighbors, family, and friends about what a Green New Deal could do for them and why a CCC would improve their life. And we need to continue planning disruptive and creative actions that put pressure on our members of Congress. Our movement needs to work to build broad public support for Markey's version of the CCC and force our members of Congress to sign the Good Jobs for All pledge, all while preparing to mobilize to ensure the bill actually passes later in the summer. Here's a timeline of how Sunrise is organizing around this critical moment. About 2 weeks ago, we kicked off the Good Jobs for All campaign. Across the country, we demanded our members of Congress take the Good Jobs for All pledge. This was the biggest day of action in our movement's history. This week, we worked with our Green New Deal champs in Congress to reintroduce the Green New Deal resolution and roll out a bill for the civilian climate corps our generation needs. In more ways than one, the past 4 years of our movement's work have been leading up to this moment. And that's why we are so glad you're here today to take up the fight for the Green New Deal we deserve. I'm feeling excited, which is really important because there's a lot more work to do. At the end of May, we're going to support hubs like yours all across the movement to hold teach-ins like this one. You'll have the opportunity to talk to your community about what the Green New Deal and what the CCC could do for you. We expect the infrastructure package to be voted on later in August. We'll continue to keep up the pressure on our members of Congress and be ready to mobilize as the final version of this package is being put together and voted on. We're in a position where we can fight for and win a massive program run by the federal government that will create millions of good jobs fighting climate change and transforming our society. That's what's on the line for our movement over these next few months. Let's take a moment, though, to appreciate the progress that we've made and show excitement for the progress to come. Can I get some plus signs in the chat for all the work that we've done? All right. I'm loving the energy coming through in the chat. In this section, we learned a lot about the moment we're in, but to summarize, Biden's infrastructure plan should be celebrated as a win for the movement, even though it's not nearly enough to meet the urgency of the crises we face. We have a shot at launching the decade of the Green New Deal with the upcoming $2.7 trillion infrastructure package. And our actions over the next few months will be crucial to building the momentum we need to get to the best and most equitable version of it passed in Congress. There are lots of amazing pieces of progressive Green New Deal legislation that we support, and our biggest priority will be getting the most transformative version of the civilian climate corps included in the infrastructure package in order to achieve our goal of good jobs for all. For this to happen, we know we'll need wide-ranging bipartisan support, and we can achieve it through effective communication of the Green New Deal's values. So in the next section, we're going to practice this by going through some of the common criticisms about the Green New Deal and how we can best respond to them. Angela, it's all you.
Thank you, Jacob. So yes, we'll need to bring as many people on the Green New Deal train as possible. And the good news is a majority of voters do say they would support Green New Deal policies, but a few people in power are doing all that they can to block that support. Remember the video we watched a bit earlier about the concept of tactical framing that's used by the media to distract us from talking about the substance of the Green New Deal? Well, politicians use it too. They spin bogus ideas and fake news to focus their base on siding with prefabricated positions. So for a little fun, let's get a refresher on some of these tactically framed statements that we've all heard too many times.
So, how's that going? This disastrous plan would be a massive government takeover
that would stifle innovation.
Wasteful and reckless spending.
Rather than setting realistic goals,
we would go from about 94 million cows to 0 cows.
That resolution will not pass the Senate because there's no way to pay for it.
It's destructive, socialist daydream.
The Green New Deal is a long shot. But right now, it's also the only plan that acknowledges what we know is coming.
What is the world that we want? What is the country that we want? And how do we get there? And how do we get there in a way that is just? And how do we get there in a way that stabilizes the climate and heals our planet? Because if we don't do that, then there will be no paradigm because there will be nothing to fight for.
Yeah, so all of these criticisms, lots of negative energy, but some of these concerns and criticisms are more valid than others. So let's break some of these down and look at how the Green New Deal actually addresses them. To start, let's get our favorite one out of the way. There will be 0 cows under a Green New Deal. This one, it's a bit ridiculous, but there are actually ways to respond in a constructive way. Factory farming creates huge methane outputs. However, cattle can be integrated into a regenerative agro-ecosystem that actively reduce agricultural emissions. Okay, on a less ridiculous note, some may be concerned that the Green New Deal will take away oil, gas, and coal jobs. But actually, the Green New Deal is rooted in a just transition for fossil fuel workers. As the climate crisis and economic inequalities worsen, communities will continue to be left behind. Coal jobs in the US have already halved since 2011, and the United Mine Workers of America recently backed a shift from coal to renewable energy, as long as the plan includes job protections. So the market is already moving away from fossil fuel jobs, and the Green New Deal will actually help transition these workers into new, cleaner industries. Okay, what about this one? That the Green New Deal will force US companies to outsource labor and materials. But actually, it will create millions of new green manufacturing jobs in the US and ensure that we continue to be a center for innovation internationally. And we hear this one pretty often too, that the Green New Deal includes a bunch of socialist policies that have nothing to do with climate change. Well, the Green New Deal is about more than climate change. It's rooted in a rights-based framework which believes that every person is entitled to the basic human rights of clean air and water, housing, healthcare, and a good job. And finally, this is the trillion-dollar criticism, that the Green New Deal will cost too much and that our children and grandchildren will be stuck with the bill. For this one, we'd love to get a little audience interaction. So drop your ideas about how the Green New Deal addresses this criticism in the chat, and I'll read some of these out. Now, we can't afford not to. Yep. Climate change adds a bunch of things that we'll have to pay for. Yep. Creates millions of jobs. Defund the military. Yeah, these are all such great ideas and responses. So there are obviously many ways to tackle this criticism, but let's point out 3 of the biggest ones. First, it costs way more to continue burning fossil fuels. Each day while we continue business as usual, we face worsening climate disasters, economic collapse, and biodiversity loss. Well, okay, so will it cost too much? No. In fact, the correct way to budget for the Green New Deal is the same way we paid for World War II. This is not a question of where we will get the money to pay for it. We already have the money. It's really a question of what our moral priorities are. But, surely it will cost too much. Well, no. Unlike stimulus packages of the past that only inflated financial markets and bailed out banks and corporations, the Green New Deal invests in real industrial production, from windmills to clean transportation infrastructure, as well as millions of good jobs that will increase immediate and long-term prosperity for the whole of society. So hopefully that exercise helped us practice talking about the Green New Deal to people who are opposed to it. We think that these three things are important to keep in mind as you continue to engage with people who criticize the Green New Deal. First, a good economist should be thinking long-term, and the Green New Deal is actually the biggest economic opportunity we have. Second, long-term thinking about what will foster freedom, care, and happiness will lead us to prosperity. And third, investing now in our future will save billions of dollars in disaster relief and empower communities. So if you have any questions about this section, please ask them in the chat now. And we're also really excited to announce that after our teach-in today, we'll be hosting electoral organizer Ed Brown to give a bonus training on how to talk effectively with others. It'll be a great space to practice the how of carrying out meaningful conversations around the Green New Deal now that you know what the Green New Deal is all about. So I'll pass it to Ed now to say a bit more about the bonus training.
We're actually going to go straight to Josiah.
All right, Josiah, take it away.
All right, I'm muted. Before we do that, I'm going to say we're going to take it to about a 5-minute break. I really appreciate everybody for being here. It's been a lot of information that everybody has been taking in. And so it is important that we take some time to first internalize it and to get a little rest so that when we come back and return, we can absorb new information that ensures that we all have the opportunity to get right back into learning about the Green New Deal. So see y'all in 5.
Had a lovely quick little break. We wanted to just quickly go over our sort of community agreements and tech stuff for everyone. We did have some people join us later. Sorry about folks who weren't able to join in the first part. So just some reminders. If you're having any tech problems, please private message Grayson, who has tech in their Zoom name. They will try to help. We will be emailing the recording and slides to registered participants later. So if you missed that first part, or if you just want to rewatch this whole teaching again, you will get the recording later. Please use the chat throughout the session to react to what's being presented. You can put plus signs in the chat, and please save any questions you have for the end of each section. So we'll remind you when to ask questions, and then we'll be sending out an FAQ sheet via email after the teach-in. We'll also have moments for you to participate and share your thoughts, so we encourage you to join in the chat. And lastly, we ask for everyone to be here in this community learning space. We just want to remind y'all that we will not tolerate bullying or hateful language in the chat, and we do have chat moderators who will kick people out if this turns into an unsafe space for community learning. So now we're going to start our next section, where we will cover climate solutions, a just transition, and then talk about how you can take action to help us win. We're all here today because we are deeply concerned about the climate crisis, and we are ready to throw down to create a society that puts people over profits and prioritizes just and effective climate solutions. In this section, we're going to briefly look at the state of the climate crisis and then dive into the climate solutions included in the Green New Deal. But first, we wanted to do a quick activity. Tell us in the chat, how anxious are you about climate change from a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not anxious at all and 10 being very anxious? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of 10s, 9s, 1000s, 8s, 7s, 2500, all over this. And a 1, I believe in us. I love it. So thank you for sharing. I really feel the weight of that. You know, as young people especially, we often have a lot of climate anxiety and climate grief, and it's really important to acknowledge those feelings and treat them with care. And it's also important to transform our feelings into action. So not to increase your anxiety too much, but let's take stock of our current climate change trajectory unless we make drastic reductions in our carbon emissions. You may recall back in 2018 when a bunch of the world's leading climate scientists, known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a sobering report that said we have until 2050 to completely stop emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases globally, and until 2030 to cut them in half. Well, here's where we are today. We're already at 1 degree Celsius of warming, and the scientific consensus is that we're projected to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius of disastrous warming sometime between 2027 and 2040. The fact is, in order to avert the worst impacts of climate chaos, we need to keep the Earth's temperature within 1.5 degrees Celsius, or about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. Yikes. The IPCC report is considered by some scientists to be a conservative estimate because it downplays the potential role of feedback loops that will exacerbate the problem without human influence. These feedback loops feed off of and speed up the process they put out of balance. So one example is Arctic sea ice. Bright white polar ice helps keep the planet cool, reflecting the sun's rays back to space. But as the ice melts due to rising temperatures, that reflective coating is lost, exposing darker bodies of water and land, which absorb more of the sun's heat, leading to greater warming and in turn to more ice melting, and so on. The threat of feedback loops means we should be even more ambitious about reaching our emissions reduction goals to prevent further runaway climate change when feedback loops get too far out of control. So we need to stop putting greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this needed to happen like the decade before yesterday. But right now, pretty much every sector of our economy relies on processes that emit greenhouse gases, including the combustion of fossil fuels and destructive land management practices. To decarbonize simply means to replace greenhouse gas emitting processes across these sectors with clean, non-emitting alternatives. Changing how every part of our economy works can be daunting to think about, But luckily, we don't have to separately change every single industry. If we convert our energy grid, which currently burns fossil fuels, to rely only on clean renewable energy, all other sectors that can use electricity, think electric cars, electrified buildings, can decarbonize. Because of this, many energy experts consider electricity a linchpin issue that can get us on the pathway to decarbonization. So in this next video, we'll hear from Saul Griffith about the American energy economy and what decarbonization would look like across sectors.
A few years ago, Saul decided to make a model of America's energy use. He ended up reading basically every available piece of data from
the Energy Information Administration, Department of Transportation, National Highway Transit Authority, the Census Bureau of Labor Statistics, and NOAA. And so we pull all of those together to build a very comprehensive picture of the US energy economy.
That picture of the US energy economy, it looks like this.
If you're just looking at the whole thing at once, it just looks like a big pile of spaghetti. It's hard to make sense of, but it just traces energy, every unit of energy. How does it enter the economy? How is it used throughout the economy?
This kind of chart is called a Sankey diagram, and it's easier to understand in 3 sections. These columns here on the left are the sources of all the energy used in the US, like natural gas, coal, solar, wind, nuclear, and oil. This column in the middle is what those energy sources get converted into. So a lot of it becomes electricity. Most oil becomes the fuel we use for transportation. And here you can see how much natural gas energy is being used to generate electricity versus being used directly to power things like cooking stoves. And over here on the right, this is where all the energy is used, broken down into incredible detail, like how much energy is being used to light shopping malls in the US, or how much energy is being used by vehicles driven for work.
So you start to get this incredibly detailed picture of all of the interconnections, which is really, really important when you do the next exercise. But what happens if we decarbonize?
Remember that carbon emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels, this stuff. And Saul says that means that to decarbonize, we just need to follow their path. The first place that leads you is here, with electricity and the energy we use to generate it, the majority of which in the US comes from 2 kinds of fossil fuel, natural gas and coal. If the US wants to decarbonize, it needs to stop getting electricity this way, and to replace it with other decarbonized energy sources. That means coal power plants, gone. Gas power plants, gone. All electricity would come from renewable sources: wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric and biomass, or nuclear energy. Decarbonizing the way we get electricity would be a huge investment, but it would also only eliminate 20% of emissions. And that's because electricity and energy are not exactly the same thing.
That doesn't solve the vehicle's emissions. It doesn't solve your heating emissions from using natural gas or fuel oil in your basement.
All these other parts of the economy draw their energy directly from fossil fuels. Like transportation, we use oil for fuel. And commercial and residential buildings, where we use gas and oil for heat. But Saul says there's a kind of elegant solution to this. You decarbonize these sectors by switching their energy source from here to here. Make all of it electric. Because we already have almost all the technology we need to do it.
Heat pumps, batteries, electric vehicles, wind turbines, nuclear power plants, yes, we know that that can work. We know we can do electric cars. We know we can do electric heat for nearly everything.
It's all, in the end, just about machines, right? We got a bunch of machines that use fossil fuel energy. We need to replace them with machines that use clean electricity. And so it really just comes down to a matter of industrial capacity. How fast can you build machines?
So I love that video, and I saw a lot of people expressing love for that beautiful data visualization, that awesome Sankey graph. If that video blew your mind, let us know in the chat. I think the simplest way to think about it is change the grid and change the machines. So electrification is one of many solutions. And as Indigenous climate activist Shia Bastida says, It's time to change our mindset towards implementation of solutions because a vibrant, fair, and regenerative future is possible. There are so many climate solutions we can and should be implementing. Most fall into the broad categories of decarbonization, reducing our emissions, and sequestration, drawing down carbon into Earth's natural sinks like the ocean, soil, and forests. There are a plethora of ways to bring our system back into balance, many using methods Indigenous people have been practicing for centuries. We already have the solutions we need. And remember, only a government-backed effort will enable us to deploy them at the scale we need for this crisis. So let's look at some of these solutions. Decarbonizing solutions are ones we are often more familiar with, like retrofitting buildings to be more energy efficient, deploying solar and wind energy, and creating alternative refrigerants that don't emit harmful greenhouse gases. We also need to build both centralized and distributed battery energy storage solutions to meet our society's on-demand energy needs. And guess what? All of these solutions also represent opportunities to put people to work with good, clean jobs. We also advocate for sequestration solutions that support and revive our natural systems to pull down and store carbon. These include solutions like regenerative agriculture and managed grazing, coastal wetlands restoration, and reforestation. The solutions can be implemented by lots of different people all over the world and also have many co-benefits, like increasing farmers' yields, building resilience to climate change, protecting biodiversity of vulnerable ecosystems, and diversifying rural economies. As we scale up these solutions, it's important that we partner with local communities to make sure they also share in these co-benefits. And once again, these solutions mean good jobs, and more good jobs. So there's a bunch of technologies we can invest in and solutions that will restore ecosystems and bring our planet back into balance. But to fight climate change, we also have to get a lot better at taking care of each other. Teaching, nursing, child and elder care, domestic and agricultural work. These care jobs are green jobs too. Care work is about making sure people have the support they need to be healthy, to grow and learn and thrive. And care work makes up some of the lowest carbon parts of our economy, the very part we need to expand. But the people who do so much of this work already, often women of color and migrants, are exploited and underpaid in today's economy. We need to invest in care workers and make sure they are included in a just transition, which we're going to talk about in the next section. For the climate solutions we've discussed, we know that incrementalism won't cut it. We've waited too long to stop emitting carbon. We simply can't slowly reduce our emissions at a rate that makes sense for the market. We need to mobilize every part of our economy and society in order to solve the climate crisis. To do this, we need massive public mobilization to create the political willpower and force our government and economy to change at the pace we need and create good green jobs in the process. So, key takeaways from this section are, we need to transition all sectors of our economy to low carbon processes, and electrification is a key strategy in achieving this. Decarbonizing our economy and sequestering the excess carbon we've already emitted will also create millions of good jobs. And number 3, the diverse array of climate solutions are ready to be deployed at scale. We just need the political will to deploy them. So if you have any questions about this section, please ask them in the chat now. And next, Jacob is going to take us through how and why we are going to do this in a just and equitable way.
Thanks, Celia. Thank you. When we talk about the big shifts in our society that the solutions to climate change require, we have to ground ourselves in the framework of a just transition that prioritizes the health and empowerment of the working class, BIPOC communities, and frontline communities that have borne the brunt of the harm caused by climate change for decades. To start us off, I'm going to ask everyone in the chat to imagine what a just transition would look like in your community. So go ahead and drop your answer in the chat. Give everybody a second to do that. More people power, poor people power, got it. Land trust, no gaps in wages, free public transportation, lots of research funding, a lot of great ideas coming through that we're going to actually talk about in the next slide here. Thank you all for sharing. So what is a just transition anyways? A just transition is direct investment in the working class and communities of color that have borne the brunt of the harm caused by climate change. A just transition is centered in Indigenous sovereignty and support for our Indigenous communities. And a just transition must support those most affected by the transition away from fossil fuels, like those who currently work in our energy sector. It's important to note that the framework of a just transition was developed by labor unions and environmental justice groups, and we are grateful to those who have been in this movement before us and allow us to stand on their shoulders. What's more, to ensure that the just transition is fully realized, we also have to make sure that marginalized communities have a meaningful say in how the Green New Deal is designed and implemented. We would be remiss to not directly discuss environmental racism when talking about what it means to have a just transition from our current fossil fuel powered economy. The video on the next slide features Josiah, who you met earlier today, talking about the impacts of environmental racism on his life and his community.
Growing up in Carson, a city in Los Angeles County, as a Black kid with childhood asthma, my parents were always worried about my ability to just breathe. I couldn't participate in gym class like normal kids, so I always had to have my inhaler on me. And to make matters worse, my middle school was less than a few miles away from one of the biggest refineries west of the Mississippi. In LA County, over 500,000 people live within a half-mile of an active oil well, which spews dangerous chemicals like benzene into the air. And of the 1.8 million Californians most impacted by environmental pollution, 92% are people of color. Living near oil production is deadly, increasing the risk of asthma, nosebleeds, respiratory issues, high-risk pregnancies, and cancer. Neighborhood drilling is one of the most visible forms of environmental racism. So what are California's elected officials doing about it? It turns out Hollywood didn't build Los Angeles. The oil industry did. It began in the 1890s. And by the 1930s, California was producing a quarter of the world's oil. Starting around then, real estate developers used decades of redlining to force generations of Black and brown communities to live in the toxic backyard of the fossil fuel industry. And from the very beginning, oil companies knew they were poisoning people. In 1943, an internal Shell oil document marked confidential warned of harmful toxins linked to oil production, stating any exposure at all is dangerous. With about 5,000 active oil wells, Los Angeles County is the largest urban oil field in the US. And right next door to where I grew up is the neighborhood of Wilmington, which is 90% Latinx and surrounded by 6 oil refineries. Through years of hard work and organizing, we've been fighting back against environmental racism. Last year, Assemblymember Al Marasucci introduced Assembly Bill 345, which would have established buffer zones of 2,500 feet between oil and gas drilling sites and sensitive areas like schools, hospitals, and homes. But in August, state senators rejected AB 345 in a 5-4 vote. 3 Democrats, Ana Caballero, Ben Hueso, and Bob Hertzberg, rejected the bill, continuing a long line of racist policymaking, taking money from big oil and standing against Californians. Hertzberg alone has taken tens of thousands of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. California prides itself on being an environmental leader, so why is it still legal to drill for oil next to our schools, our hospitals, our homes? You know, when your entire family has asthma, you, your brother, your father, when you find out that those flare-ups aren't just because of the DNA in your blood, it makes you upset, and it completely alters your way of thinking. There was a purposeful connection between where you live and where fossil fuel industries decide to do business. I want you to be angry at your elected officials. I want you to let them know that they can't continue to get away with this. Just because it is individually affecting me or a larger community of Black and brown people doesn't mean that it's never going to get to you.
Wow. Every time I watch Josiah speak in that video, I get the chills. Contextualizing the just transition also requires that we talk about our communities and the uneven impacts of climate change and economic insecurity that have created the environmental racism that Josiah so eloquently describes in that video. Another community that must be centered in a just transition is made of the many indigenous tribes and people whose stolen land we currently live on. Indigenous people have continued to be on the front lines of defending the land, water, and air we breathe. And we know that traditional indigenous ecological knowledge is critical to monitoring and combating climate change. A just transition must recognize indigenous sovereignty and include reparations for indigenous communities. Additionally, we have to acknowledge that indigenous organizers are putting their bodies on the line to protect the environment and disrupt the fossil fuel industry, like the ongoing protests of major pipeline projects like Line 3, Line 5, and the Dakota Access Pipeline. As an environmental justice movement, we must support these organizers and center these communities in the work that we do. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said when she reintroduced the Green New Deal resolution this past Tuesday, we refuse to go from an economy of oil barons to solar barons. We can imagine a world free of fossil fuels and powered by publicly owned renewable energy because that world is not too far away from where we are now. Not only is this world possible, but did you know that we have historical examples of large-scale changes to our power infrastructure from not too long ago? During the New Deal era, we electrified much of America for the first time. Private utilities and the market had not delivered accessible electricity across all parts of America because their profit motives didn't align with providing power to all people. So the people figured out how to do it themselves. Private utilities and corporations resisted the Rural Electrification Administration, which created and funded hundreds of local electricity cooperatives around the country. These local co-ops still exist, and together they supplied power to half of America's land area. They're a living example of how the people can control our power grid. These examples of how we can achieve an energy democracy are just a few of the ways to ensure that we have a just transition. As we've already discussed, the Green New Deal would create millions of good union jobs. But what about those jobs in fossil fuels that are lost? It's true that many jobs in the energy sector pay middle-class wages, but why were there good jobs in the first place? This is largely because workers in industries such as coal organized to win safety protections, healthcare, pensions, and family-sustaining wages. In other words, many jobs in the extractive economy are lucrative because of unionization. However, this was not just true for workers in energy, but in many other sectors as well. The first half of the 20th century saw workers joining unions on a mass scale, building the middle class as we now know it. It remains true to this day that union members, on average, earn more and enjoy greater protections on the job. Recognizing the threat to their control, corporations and governments have waged a decades-long attack on workers. As unionization has declined in this country, so has the prosperity. Bolstering union membership will be critical for ensuring a just transition for fossil fuel workers and more broadly, transforming our economy for the better. Good paying union jobs in clean energy will create a healthier environment for everyone to live in, and a federal wage, jobs, and benefits guarantee will ensure that fossil fuel workers are able to transition into the new economy we create. Unions will be a key ally, ensuring that fossil fuel workers are guaranteed wages and benefits and are provided retraining, as well as helping to develop the new jobs that will be central to our new economy. For any of this to happen, we must have Biden pass a federal jobs guarantee. We've talked already about the importance of the Civilian Climate Corps in kicking off the decade of the Green New Deal, but it's just the beginning. We can and should think bigger. Popularized in FDR's Economic Bill of Rights and championed by civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, a federal jobs guarantee would end involuntary unemployment, promising economic security to all who want it. Such a policy would put millions to work fixing our nation's most immediate needs, such as caring for our elders or restoring wetlands. In contrast to our current system that relegates working people to live in poverty, a jobs guarantee would provide a fair labor market floor, an incentive for employers to raise standards, and market stabilization during economic downturns. Where the New Deal fell short and perpetuated racial injustice, a jobs guarantee will be community-driven and address deep inequities felt by marginalized communities. Representative Ayanna Pressley recently introduced a federal jobs guarantee bill to bring this idea back into the public narrative. To achieve all this, we have to transition from thinking in the framework of the social safety net brought on by the New Deal and into a new era that includes a rights-based framework. As it stands today, the American social safety net is a last resort and a flawed one at that. As millions lost their jobs during COVID-19, many Americans fell into food, housing, and healthcare insecurity. We must imagine an economy and society that provides for everyone regardless of employment status, especially during a crisis. We won't know the stats for some time, but potentially millions lost their health insurance under a system which is tied to employment rather than one that sees health as a right. Instead of the flawed healthcare systems we have, the failures of which we're experiencing today, the Green New Deal calls for universal affordable coverage regardless of employment. Instead of allowing thousands and thousands of people to suffer through homelessness, we need to think of housing as a guaranteed right in one of the richest countries in the history of the world. And we need to reverse the course we're on of divesting from equitable and accessible public transit and create the infrastructure needed to give equal access to transit to marginalized communities. Rather than a system designed to catch you when you fall, we need to shift to an approach with a baseline foundation of guaranteed rights. So that was a long and important section, but the key takeaways that we want to emphasize is that a just transition must center frontline and vulnerable communities as active forces in shaping the Green New Deal. It must empower fossil fuel workers and invest in good paying union jobs in all sectors through a federal jobs guarantee. And it must reimagine privileges like housing and healthcare as guaranteed rights that all humans innately deserve. We're going to head to the next section, but first, if you have questions about what we just talked about, please ask them in the chat now. We know that we can't get complacent and assume the politicians will deliver these things to us. So now we're going to focus on some ways for you to take action to build the people power we need to win. Josiah, take it away.
Wow. Just going to allow a couple folks to let their questions trickle in as we fully internalize the power of such a vision for an economy that puts workers and marginalized communities first. It's imperative that we make this vision a reality and come true. All right. Now, let's recap and think about what actions we need to take in our hubs and communities to make it a reality, as I was just speaking to. The Green New Deal is a powerful vision that imagines what an environmentally sustainable, just, and equitable future could look like and how to get there. Do you remember what it was like for you when you first heard about the Green New Deal? I know for me, it was something that spoke to my lived experience on the ground. I'd love to hear about it and how it made you feel. Just drop your responses in the chat and let's experience that in community together. Profound, hopeful, yeah. Exciting is definitely one. Fired up, yeah. Thank you, everybody. I deeply resonate with all of that. It gave so many of us hope again and galvanized youth activists all over the country. That's why this movement exists. This helped us build up people power we use to get Green New Deal champions and progressive candidates into office at all levels of government, from local city councils to Congress. Our movement has spent the past 4 years building up to this moment, a moment where we can actually pass something into law that will signify the very first step of the Green New Deal. We've been able to push Democratic candidates to embrace more ambitious climate plans. We've helped get out the youth vote, and we've done so many disruptive and creative actions that have made our movement and our vision for the country impossible to ignore. This year, we have a Democrat in the White House and Democrats controlling Congress, just barely. This infrastructure package is the priority for Joe Biden and Democrats in Congress. This is our movement's once in a generation shot to make sure a civilian climate corps that employs 1.5 million people, fights climate change, and transforms our society is passed into law. We always knew that the Green New Deal was more than one bill or 1 year. The transformation we are seeking is so big, so expansive, that it's going to take years of persistent organizing, both nationally and locally, to ensure that many pieces of legislation are passed along the way to manifest its fullest vision. Our movement needs to win the first pillar of the Green New Deal this year and continue to build our movement's power to win over the next decade. We need to keep growing our hubs and building more and more leaders. We need to keep taking action in the streets and in the halls of power. We need to pressure our Congresspeople to sign the Good Jobs for All pledge and support the reintroduction of the Green New Deal, the reintroduced Green New Deal. We need to keep talking to our neighbors and friends and classmates and family about the Green New Deal and the world we want to see. We need to share our vision with them and bring them into this fight too. So all I gotta say is, let's do this. And here's the next step. We need to share the Green New Deal's vision for our future, dispel misinformation, and inspire others to join the movement. If you were pumped by this teach-in, guess what? You can host one in your own community. Our movement is preparing to hold teach-ins all across the country on June 5th and 6th. We're putting together toolkits, trainings, and everything you need to hold a teach-in just like this one wherever you live. It doesn't matter if you're part of a hub and have been part of Sunrise for a while, or if you've never done anything like this before. We'll be here to help you every step of the way. Day one, we'll be hosting another teach-in just like what we did today, but with even more people. Day two provides an opportunity to highlight local movements through a speaker series. A link is going to be posted in the chat, and you'll click that link in order to register and hold a teach-in in your own community and help us build that movement for a Green New Deal. I'd immediately sign up. As soon as we got this idea, ran with it. All right, great. I know what you're thinking. What can I do right now to take action and push our movement forward? One way is to sign up through what you see on your screen right now. The app allows you to easily find your members of Congress and demand they support the Green New Deal and the Civilian Climate Corps. So that's just one way that you can offer that support. And please, take a moment to fill out our survey. We'd love to hear your feedback. We want to make this teach-in even better in the future. So your honest feedback is super helpful and much appreciated. In order to ensure that we all have the opportunity to share in community together in these next couple of teach-ins that we have rolling out in June and make it even more successful than it was today, we'd really, really appreciate your support. All right. We are so grateful to be in this moment together with you, and we appreciate your time and energy. Frankly, we simply appreciate your presence. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then Ed will lead through a fun bonus mini training on how we talk with others about the movement we're building. I want to again reiterate my thanks for everybody who put in the effort behind what we're doing here today, all those you saw on the slide just now, and again, everybody who came and brought their presence to this teach-in.